Hey everyone, it's Mac here, and welcome back to the Let's Code series, or I guess I should say welcome to the Let's Code series. I've been working on this series for a little while now, and I think that the whole thing would really benefit from a new introduction, if you will. If you're looking for a more detailed explanation of why this series exists, you can check out either of these other two videos on the playlist, or they might not be on the playlist at some point, but you should be able to find them pretty easily. Though, if you are watching the series for the first time, I would recommend you just skip these two. The basic idea behind this series is that I would try to learn how to write a new version of my personal website, that's this thing right here, or at least in its current state, that's this thing right here, using super basic web technologies, CSS and HTML, JavaScript, PHP, no frameworks, no Squarespace, just super basic, very straightforward web design. Now, the thing to know is that I'm not a web developer. I'm not a programmer. I have little to no experience with these technologies, but I was inspired by like these early filmmaking YouTube channels to just move forward. I feel like, and I think most people would agree, that there's a special insight that comes with learning how to do something, and hopefully that will make for interesting content, especially in the case of programming and coding and computing in general. The distance between like your veteran industry professional and a total noob can be very, very wide, and I'm sure I'm not alone in my experience of like clicking on a really cool looking programming tutorial that professes to be sort of base level and then being totally bulldozed over by the content, not because I didn't understand what was going on in the video or I couldn't follow the steps, but because, I mean, the just level of assumed knowledge was so great, exponentially higher than my own. I think I'm in a pretty interesting position to maybe contribute something pretty interesting to the YouTube zeitgeist. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not familiar with much of this at all. I'm very new to web design. I have a little bit of experience with HTML and CSS and like a tiny bit of experience with JavaScript, mostly in the context of making changes to pre-built websites, but building my own website from scratch is very far from something I'm well qualified to be doing. The first thing to know is that despite what you might be expecting, this is not a super base level web design class. It's not really a class at all, but I'm not interested in making a class, and part of the reason for that is that the basics of any of the tools we'll be using are fairly readily available, whether you get it through something like Skillshare on lynda.com or just YouTube videos that cover the type of thing. It's very easy to understand all the basic pieces of HTML or CSS or JavaScript. There's plenty of classes that will just go through every single part of those languages. You probably haven't had much of an issue just learning like the individual CSS selector options, but knowing what to actually do with those is a very important question that doesn't have a great answer on YouTube. So I'm setting my aim at like a true intermediate level. To give context, all I'm really expecting someone to be able to do is on a website, go into the inspector view and not necessarily really be able to understand everything that's going on, but be able to sort of look at the code and have a general understanding of what's happening. Like if you can recognize this is a CSS selector, I don't necessarily know anything about what's inside of it, but you can recognize it. I think this is a great set of videos for people to watch. Now, I do take a lot of time and do a lot of research and go through a fair amount of grief to try to make sure that what I'm showing in these videos is like the best and most efficient way to do things. I have backtracked a bit with this series already and done a few things over again, but I don't want to do a ton of that. Once or twice is a good learning experience because when I come back, I'll know why the thing we did first was a mistake. But, it'd just be frustrating to watch if I'm doing the same thing 400 times over. And I do want to make the series, even though I am very careful to say it's not a class, I do want to make it easy to follow along with. Now, as far as what I would recommend to get started, if you're just have no experience whatsoever with HTML or CSS, they're not very complex languages. I mean, like a lot of people don't even say that they're programming languages, which, seems fair, because the actual structure of HTML in particular is very, very simple and can be learned like in a weekend. And the same is true of CSS, really. CSS is a bit more complex. So if you are not familiar with either the languages at all, what I would recommend are a few resources. The first of which are just lynda.com and Skillshare. You can also find YouTube videos that do the same type of thing if you don't want to pay for anything, but these are great like online just learning video platforms that, vet the people well, I don't know if they vet the people doing classes, but generally speaking, the people doing classes know what they're talking about. I haven't used lynda.com in a while. I pretty recently was on Skillshare, and if you do that, there's like free trials for both of these. I would recommend this guy, Caleb Tulian's classes. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I went through his CSS class, I believe, and if any of the other ones are close to that one, they'll all be pretty great. The other thing to recommend is this website here. This is w3schools.com. This is a very popular like resource for web developers, to the point that if you were to just Google like a particular element of CSS or HTML or JavaScript, one of the first links that pops up would most likely be an article on this website. But the great thing about this website is that it's sort of structured like a textbook. You can click on, for example, HTML, and just using this sidebar, grow through like a chapter at a time and really get an in-depth look at how the language functions. And it's also built on examples, interactive examples. Almost every page has one of these try it yourself buttons where you can go in and just literally try it yourself. And that's not to mention that because all of these languages are plain text, you could literally do the same thing with just like text edit and a browser. One other thing I might mention are these like web developer games. These are really weird and interesting. I honestly don't know if I like them. There are a few of these games out there. The thing is, there's no real reason to learn every single option you have with HTML or CSS. Like if you're working with CSS, you don't need to learn every type of selector there is. There are 32 selectors just talked about in this little game here, and there's not really a compelling reason to like memorize every single one of those. That's not really how this works. But while I wouldn't recommend like memorizing every type of selector you could use with CSS or something, these are actually good learning tools as well, because like you learn about selectors that you maybe previously didn't know about. And it's not just like a list of, hey, here's every way you could use a CSS selector. These are real examples. You're doing it yourself, so you understand how they work. You know, there's a lot of these types of games. There's this other one that's like a Flexbox thing. You could just Google like CSS games or HTML games. There's a lot of these. You know, people are targeting like kids with this maybe isn't exactly what we were looking for, but you know, people target kids with you know, programming and web design type stuff all the time. So even if there's a game and it's just aimed at kids, you know, you can still learn a lot from it. So that's something to take a look at. And finally, I just wanted to mention an interesting tip that I sort of stumbled face first into, just because like I'm an avid podcast listener. Well, sometimes. And that's that there are a lot of you know, web design or programming podcasts. And honestly, very few of these are like centered around beginners. You know, there's a few like this one maybe that's like for beginner programmers, but most of these, like there's this one called Shop Talk that's just for like front-end web developers and UX designers, and this other one, the Changelog, very similar. And the weird thing about these podcasts is that they're not intended for new users. Like I feel like the people running the podcast view their audience as like their peers, basically other web designers who just want to stay up to date on what's going on in like the world of web design. And a lot of what they talk about is frameworks. And I mean, the amount of times that they've mentioned a specific like CSS or JavaScript or HTML thing that I totally understand, I can count on one hand. But they talk about a lot of stuff that, you know, you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about as a beginner web developer. A great example is like accessibility, keeping your site accessible for people who interact with it in a way that's, you know, maybe not what you would expect. And that's a great thing to be thinking about while building my website, because it's not going to be this huge long process at the end of me. Well, ideally there won't be a huge long process at the end of me going through and trying to make my site that I've just finished accessible so more people can actually use it. And that's not to say that my website will be or is in its current state some kind of accessibility dream or will be the easiest website to work with. It's certainly neither of those two things, but you know, it's a good thing to be thinking about sort of end level things while you're first building the website. Hopefully we'll end up with less mistakes to fix in the end. But that is all for this video. That's all I really wanted to talk about. I hope you continue to check through the playlist. And if you do watch a little bit further, I hope you learned something interesting. So, you know, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. I don't know if this video made like any sense at all.